Welcome back. Welcome. Unit 15, Unit 16, Media Technology and Communication, and Module 13. We're going to go ahead and get that lesson going. Covering a lot, but it's a lot of duplication, so there's not a ton of slides. That makes it nice. I could teach a whole class on this. In fact, I have taught a whole class on this in the past when we talk about mass communication and transmitting messages to large audiences. So it's only through technology that mass media can exist. While our interpersonal interactions are direct, our interactions with mass media messages are indirect, as they require technology or a third party to facilitate the connection. Mass communication involves transmitting messages, to many people through either print or electronic media. While talking to someone, hang on one second, sorry. Also, my mic level's a little high today. I'm not sure what that's about. Need to check that. While talking to someone about a movie you just watched or a book you read is interpersonal communication. Watching the Academy Awards show on TV or clips on the internet through, let's say, YouTube, is mass communication. In this section, we kind of trace the development of various forms of communication and what led to the next new invention in communication, and so on. As we trace the development of these forms of mass media, we'll take note on the new technologies and competition between the old media formats and the newer media formats. And then we're going to talk about how these formats have made media messages more interpersonal and even more personalized. In short, mass media served large segments of the population with limited messages, evolved into micromedia that will serve narrow interest groups. The brief discussion here will be these changes, those recent changes of how media operates in our lives, and it'll be expanded more in the following chapter on new media and communication, which I'm covering in this unit as well, this module as well. So it's a really interesting topic, and it's really cool. As we move closer to our current digital age of media, we can see that the new media formats are invented and made available to people much more quickly than the media that came before it. While it took 175,000 years for writing to become established, it took about 1,000 years for printing to gain a firm foundation. And then we have, radio, television, movies. That penetrated society within a few decades, and then digital media gained prominence in even less time. So everything's moved fast. So let's talk about print media first. Printing press and subsequent technological advances related to paper manufacturing and distribution led to the establishment of print as the first mass medium. While the ability to handwrite manuscripts and even reproduce them existed before the print revolution, such processes took considerable time and skill, making books and manuscripts too expensive for most everyone in society, other than the powerful or privileged, basically the rich. Despite the advent of many forms of mass media, print is still important as a channel for information and as an industry. For example, in the United States, about 3.1 billion books, 1,400 daily newspapers still exist, and 1,900 magazines are published in a given year. So print's still there. It's becoming weaker and weaker, but it's still there. And even when we're seeing print kind of slide out of the print segment, let's take the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, for instance, a fairly local newspaper. We see it moving to a digital-only format. So they still exist, and now it's got video clips and audio clips and all those things. That they also have social media channels. They have a YouTube channel. So, I mean, they're trying to catch all markets, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So the manuscript age is the period in history that began at roughly 3500 BCE with the introduction of written text and lasted until the printing revolution of 1450. Of course, before writing emerged as a form of expression, humans drew on caves, right? They made sculpture, pottery, jewelry, other forms of visual expression. The spread of writing, however, as a means of documenting philosophy, daily life, government laws, and business transactions, is sort of a necessary precursor to the print revolution. We needed that to happen to get everybody on board. And I apologize, Lola. Little Lola is being needy this morning. So, physical and technical limitations of time prevented the written word from becoming a mass medium for a long time, as texts were painstaking to reproduce by hand, and reproduction was slow, using basic printing technologies such as wood cutouts and then hand drawing things, right? The high price of those texts kept it out of most people's hands, plus the fact that, honestly, many couldn't read. Then we have Gutenberg pop in, and he's the inventor of the printing press. He didn't really invent much, because technically all the pieces were there. He just put it all together in a movable typeset. So, mass reproduction and distribution of text really actually began in East Asia at about 700 CE, about 700 years before Gutenberg. They used woodblock printing to produce Buddhist text. But Gutenberg's use of a press to mash paper against a typeset, as opposed to the Chinese method of manually rubbing the paper against the typeset, made the process faster and more effective. Additionally, the rise of printing in East Asia didn't become a print revolution because the audience of the text was very limited, as they had low literacy rates. All right. Explosion of printing following that 1450 invention of the printing press definitely proves that print was our first mass medium. Books at the time were often shorter than they are today, but they were still the earliest form of communication to be distributed to the masses, and that led to significant cultural and social transformation. In 1454 to 1500, 30,000 books and pamphlets were published in Europe. Between 1450 and 1500, 20 million books were printed. During the 1600s, between 150 and 200 million books were printed in Europe. Given that Europe's population was only about 78 million people, that's 3 books per person, you can see that it took off. But again, mainly the rich had the book because it wasn't super affordable at the front end. Now that changed as more and more books were published, as cheaper paper was developed, and more and more printing presses were put online, book prices became cheaper. The printing and distribution of books led to a cultural transformation, just like radio, just like television, and internet have too. The rise of literacy, the available literature, the religious text, the dictionaries, reference books allowed people to learn things for themselves. It helped them distinguish themselves from others by what they read and what they knew, and figuratively travel beyond their localized lives to lands and other time periods. Right? Before this, Lola, please stop. People relied on storytellers, clergy, teachers, or other leaders to gain information. Publishers still acted as gatekeepers, just as modern mass media outlets do today. But limited content and voices that circulated on it limited the content and voices that circulated on the new medium. But despite of that, or in spite of that, the world has opened up quickly, and it opened up largely in a way it never had before. With that jumping demand of books from the 1700s and 1800s, because they were cheaper to make, it really kind of leads into the magazine boom of the 1900s. Let's look at our timeline of newspapers. So you can see that in 1690, the first North American newspaper is published in Boston. It had an anti-British tone, and then it was banned. In 1704, the Boston Newsletter is the first newspaper in the colonies to be regularly published, and people were taking that in shipping packets. And it might be, by the time it got to you, it might be 1 month old, 2 month old, but think about it, it was the newest news you had. You got some dry goods from Boston. Let's say you lived, in Savannah, came by boat. It might be 2 months old, month and a half old, but it was still fresher news than most people had. In 1721 to 29, the Franklin brothers began to dominate the newspaper market in Boston. And in 1729, Benjamin Franklin runs the Pennsylvania Gazette. It was well respected for the quality of its contents, and it's one of the first to really generate revenue through advertisements. In 1784, there you go, morning dyslexia, sorry about that. The first newspaper is published in the United States, it's a daily, all right? Most of the others were weeklies or bi-weeklies, but we have our first daily. The Pennsylvania Packet and the Daily Advertisers, they are the first two daily newspapers in the United States. And in 1833, Benjamin Day, the founder of the New York Sun, changes its pricing, its distribution, and even the contents of the newspapers by cutting cost of paper to 1 penny per issue and selling them individually on the streets through vendors rather than subscription services. The Sun focused more on human interest stories and eventually became sensationalized paper, where you could find out who, you can see the picture of a woman who's pregnant on the cover and says, "I'm having Bigfoot's baby," things like that. But early on, it didn't do that, right? Early on, it was still trying to give good, solid news. 1848, we've got the Associated Press. It's formed. 6 New York newspapers agreed to share incoming information, and they really kind of create a information network for news. The news is still transmitted through telegraph and other cable or wire services to this day. Okay, we don't really think about it, but it does happen. In the late 1800s, many newspapers practiced what they called yellow journalism, meaning sensational stories like scandals, tragedies, Bigfoot's baby, trying to use attention-getting devices to attract customers. The New York Times begins to distance itself from yellow journalism, and it ushers in a period of factual and rigorous reporting, which they still practice today. In 1855, the Village Voice is published in Greenwich Village, New York, beginning of the underground and alternative newspapers. I worked for one of those in the St. Louis market called the Riverfront Times. It was a blast. We took on articles that many people weren't willing to run because they were sometimes a little bit anti-government, anti-established government. They weren't negative pieces by any stretch, but they brought to light to the public how sometimes politicians try to get rich by using their office. It also served alternative groups to help them, the LGBTQ crowd, to help them find others of like-minded interest and, promote their clubs, things of that nature. So, huge movement in newspapers to kind of personalize the information even more. All right. So, and then in 1980, the Columbus Dispatch was the first newspaper to publish online content. 1980. 1982, USA Today was launched. I worked as a freelancer for them as well. They used a very visual style, bright colors, great use of images and language and size. It was kind of like television news meets printed newspaper. It still may be fine. I believe USA Today is still published. I haven't seen one. They're the hotel newspaper now. I haven't seen one. Well, I haven't been anywhere this year. For those of you who don't know, my father-in-law is quite ill. I mean, I've been places, but I honestly haven't paid attention to see if any of the hotels I've stayed in briefly, and I do mean briefly, I've tried to limit my travels to as few overnights as possible because he is under hospice care and his time is short. So it's changed kind of the way I've traveled this year, but I believe early in the year, around January, I saw my last USA Today that I saw. But I do believe they exist still. And the Drudge Report in 1998. It's an online gossip and news aggregation site. It breaks a story which Newsweek magazine picks up, which talks about an affair Bill Clinton had with his intern, Monica Lewinsky. Magazines started in 1741. Colonial magazines are published. Benjamin Franklin is involved in this one too, guys. He's really big in the publishing game. Early 1800s, there's about 100 magazines in publication in 1825. So they're still struggling. They're still trying to find their niche. 1820s, you have people like Mark Twain and Ralph Waldo Emerson being published in specific magazines. 1821, the Saturday Evening Post. It's a big deal, still published today. It's the longest running published magazine in the United States, one of the oldest in the world. There's only a couple in Europe that predate it. And then the first women's magazine, Ladies Magazine, was founded, and I believe that one's only available online now. But it was a big deal through the 1970s, and it was a pioneering magazine through the women's rights movements, so especially when they were seeking the right to vote. Magazines, kind of in the 1850s, started to pick up on technology and different colored inks, so they started creating higher quality illustrations and sketches, but they weren't true photographs. In 1865, The Nation, goodness gracious, The Nation is published. It is a political-based, and it's one of the first liberal publications, we'll say it that way. It certainly, liberal was a different phrase at that time. But it was catered towards educated people and people who question what politicians were actually doing. And if one thinks about it, 1865, our nation was undergoing a lot of change as we were coming back together. So, very important. It brought to light some of the problems with Reconstruction. So, it was an important magazine. 1870s to the early 1900s, the Postal Act of 1879 was passed, which lowered the cost of postage for magazines, which helped them use the rail system to grow in membership from coast to coast. We'll say it that way. 1900s to 1960s is a peak time for magazine success. There was a rise in investigative journalism in the early 1900s, which led to newspaper-like coverage in the magazine world. In the 1920s and 30s, we get Reader's Digest, Time, and Life magazine. Magazine played a key role in in-depth coverage during two world wars and cultural revolutions like the civil rights movement in the 1960s. See? Now, the 1960s also brings in big time, too, because television starts to erode and becomes the new mass medium of choice. National magazines lose their advertisers to the television. And, you know, it starts to be the death knell for magazines. 1970s to present day. Magazines adapt changing times by devoting pages or entire publications covering even newspaper and movies. Think about People magazine, 1974 it started. Provide news on a wide range of celebrities. You know, they became more specialized, trying to serve niche audiences. Honestly, most people prefer to watch television or listen to radio than read. Speaking of radio, let's talk about sound mass media. Telegraph, 1840, Morse code, dots and dashes, the transcontinental telegraph in 1861. While it couldn't translate the human voice, and it was fixed, so ships and trains couldn't really communicate at that moment in time. However, it was big on moving news across the country. It helped people know that the Civil War ended in a more expedient fashion, than previous wars had been. Wireless sound transmission, Marconi, he could move sound waves about 1.5 miles. Think about it. Wireless, first wireless. The wireless telegraph used electromagnetic waves and signals coded in pulses. Again, Morse code. And it's the precursor of the radio. Marconi basically is the father of the radio, although he didn't quite see. There were some differences in his invention in radio. Lead, DeForest, was competing with Marconi. He really focused on reception, conduction, and amplification. And this is really modern radio. So let's jump into the timeline for radio. The first commercial radio station in 1909. And it was in San Jose, California, of all the places. A doctor buys it. And he uses it primarily to promote his school of radio, because there wasn't any place for anyone to get an education on how to work on radios or work in radio stations. 1919, first non-commercial radio station goes on the air at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. 1920, KDKA, a station credited for the beginning of commercial broadcast radio. Now, it received much of its financing from Westinghouse, which, interestingly enough, had a wing that produced radios. It gains national attention for airing election results during the 1920 presidential election. In 1921, U.S. Commerce Department licensed 5 radio stations. One of those stations was in my old stomping grounds at KMOX Radio in St. Louis, Missouri. Those radio stations were allowed to broadcast with like 50,000 red hot watts of power. So they could transmit from St. Louis into the mountains of Colorado. It was pretty cool. You know, we're getting the news out to a lot of people, right? In 1922, first broadcasting network is created by the New York station WEAF to give advertisers a discount and allow them to reach multiple audiences. 1923, more than 600 commercial and non-commercial radio stations are in operation. And, more importantly, or as importantly, over 500,000 radios that we would listen to had been sold to consumers. In 1929, 5.5 million radios are now in use, right? It made radio a powerful mass medium. And yes, I did work in radio as well. But we won't really talk much about that. Late 1920s, NBC is formed. It broadcasts the Welcome Home Lindbergh broadcast and the parade. So, pretty cool. First transcontinental flight, and you get coverage from that. 1930s and 40s, it was the center of Americans' living rooms. Now, eventually television takes over, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but at that moment in time, radio was the biggest thing around. In the 1950s, radio technology had transformed so much that you had pocket-sized portable transistor radios. And radio started to partner with car manufacturers. So in the 1950s, you start to see AM radios, at least, in cars. And by the 1960s, late 60s, mid to late 60s, we'll say it that way, we have AM, FM radios. And then we started to see the top 40 format, or modern music format of radio stations. They wouldn't play modern music, but they were playing what was popular at that time, and that would have been in the 1950s that starts. In the 1970s to 90s, talk radio grows. KMOX becomes almost solely talk radio, news, traffic, and weather. WSB around here in the Atlanta area would be the comp on that. And then you had, really in the 1970s and through the 90s, you have this segmentation of radio formats. In the 1990s, I worked for a radio station briefly called KPNT 105.7 The Point in the St. Louis market. And that was alternative music, so it played things like, I'm trying to think, we got Nirvana and Pearl Jam and countless other bands that we played, that were that new music of grunge. So, yeah, we segment radio in the 1980s and 90s, and then they even start in the 90s to have online streaming capabilities for radio stations. When we think about visual mass media, the thing that's going to kill the radio, obviously 40,000 years ago we have cave drawings, right? Then we talk about in Greece, ancient Greece, Plato talks about, he talks about the analogy of the cave, where what's real and what's not real. One of my favorites there. I don't know. Maybe you guys learn it. Maybe you don't anymore. So, Plato also talks about the actual productions, plays that are being put on at theaters. What's interesting is his evaluation of theater in that era was he was kind of appalled that it was mainly sex, food, drinking, wine, wealth, and violence, right? And, Plato railed against those things. He really tried to keep the people focused on positives and the betterment of society, but Plato, unfortunately, probably would be aggravated, because if you think about television today, we pretty much cover sex, food, drink, wealth, and violence still today on television. So nothing really has changed, right? We just, instead of going to the theater, we get to see it on the TV. The TV initial success as a mass medium came largely from formats and programming strategies. These were already being implemented by radio stations, so they kind of brought it over. The radio had a thing called candid microphone, TV candid camera. They pulled in large stars, both in radio and in movies, to make TV popular. Now, it obviously grew in popularity in the 1940s and 1950s. It sort of became a de facto entertainment source. It saw a drop in nightclubs attendance, radio listening, and even book circulation, especially in the library level. Also, when television kicked in, it had about a 20% drop within the first 5 years on movie ticket sales, and eventually a 40% drop in movie ticket sales. By 1951, television status as the most important mass media was cemented. The mid-50s until cable TV boom of 1980s, broadcast television was the golden age. It was what it was. You had three major networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC. And then they had the colorization rush where they wanted to bring colored television to the masses. My parents' first television that they got at their wedding in 1970 was a black and white television. I inherited that, and I played my Atari 2600 on that television. We didn't have a color television until 1980 in the house. So my first few years of watching cartoons like Speed Racer and Scooby-Doo and others, Speed Buggy, they were in black and white. So, and then of course in 1980 I got to see them in color, which was amazing. Cable and satellite TV, I mentioned in 1980, that starts to kind of kick in. The national government gets involved. I'm not going to dive deep into it, but Time Warner becomes a major player. You had HBO as a major player, and then Ted Turner's WTBS as a major player, as well as CNN, okay, on the Turner networks. They were the major players. From 1976 to 1980, cable television started becoming the top choice for TV programming, with satellite TV as number 2, and number 3 actually being over-the-airways TV by 1980. In 2012, 90% of households subscribed to cable, satellite, or fiber optic television. The only television I have now, like many of you, is through apps and through my internet feed, right? But back then, it was still a big deal. You'd had 180 channels, potentially. So, the internet and digital media age then is born in the 1990s because of the advent of the internet, right? It was not invented then. It was just really taking off then. Media used to define by their delivery systems is a binary code, ones and zeros. So, ones and zeros for everything. Think about how the internet has changed everything. Now we watch television through the internet, we can listen to the radio through the internet, we can read books over the internet. Man, it has changed everything. In the 1960s, the United States Defense Department called a department called Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, begins to develop a communication network called ARPANET. And it was designed for the military. And it was designed in case there was natural disasters, technical malfunctions, or nuclear war. I learned about ARPA in the late 1970s, which was already in its next stage, because I grew up next to an air base. My friends were Air Force. Well, actually, they were many different branches. The air base that I lived next to was Military Airlift Command and Strategic Airlift Command, so it basically had all branches of military, including Coast Guard, there, so that they could coordinate efforts to help each other. The net, it was called in its developmental stage, is starting to be used and designed by, or adjusted by, college campuses in the 1970s to early 80s. The National Science Foundation in 1982 realizes how good it can communicate to, and so really, you really start to see college campuses really picking it up, especially college professors, so they could collaborate on research and development. The collapse of the Soviet Union brings to an end, really, ARPANET. But they had already begun to utilize other programs that were similar. And other people started using ARPANET, which meant ARPANET couldn't really be turned off, because now college campuses are using it. So by 1993, you have me in school, in college after 2 years of baseball, and I learned about the internet primarily there by going to college in 1993. I learned about networks with, internet and intranet at that time. So, I mean, the things are not new, folks. This is not a new thing. And the net has developed so much that you've got pictures, sound, video. We use it to play video games. In 1993, we're playing video games like Doom and Quake against each other. By 1990, I think in 1995, Quake, Civilization, the very first generation of that game. We played it against each other through computer networks at other schools. In 2005, Web 2.0 is the network standard, and this is where you start to get, a lot of other net-based programs jumping off. Flickr, YouTube, Wikipedia, Facebook. Allows us to communicate in a better manner, quicker, with more data, more information. Not always correct information, remember that. So, the information function of of mass media is important because, think about it, it's always been there, whether it was newspapers, radio stations, television stations, magazines, internet. It's there to keep us informed. It's there to help us understand our world around us. Instructive function of mass media is there to do just that. Sometimes they're teaching type programs. Think about the public broadcast system, where you might have watched Sesame Street or other programming, right? Even YouTube now has instructive functions. Just in case you're wondering, you can watch a video on how to take the intake manifold off a 2005 Saab 9.3 Turbo and put it back on your car. Do it yourself and save yourself a ton of money. It exists. It's there. It's real. So its instructive function is very real. And a bonding function, we know about that through Facebook and other medias, where you can, Snapchat, where you guys can kind of exist together and communicate together. And that became really prevalent in an event like 9/11, or when there's tornadoes or bad storms or an earthquake in your region. It can help bring people together that way too, and bring it to the nation that a section of the country needs help. So, I made many friends from the flood of 93. I helped sandbag several communities along the Mississippi River. These communities date back to some of my early heritage from the French side of my family. St. Genevieve. It's got one of the oldest churches west of the Mississippi River that would not be a mission out completely west, okay? It had an established church that had been there since the 1600s. So, early 1600s. And what was cool about that was the television was picking it up, the radio was picking it up across the nation, and the internet was giving it its information as well. People came from all over to help us sandbag, save communities, save lives, save historical buildings. For instance, Audubon, the guy who drew the pictures of the birds, before he took off to go do that, he was a store clerk in St. Genevieve, and some of his earliest works are there, where he just did drawings and gave them to town folk about there were plants and birds and animals that he drew. We didn't lose those things because other people came out to help, and they breached the levee at a different place, which again is where many of my French relatives lived. But it was a better place to breach the levee and let the waters flow in to save some historical towns. And the only thing we had to do is rebuild a old fort that was built by the British, no, by the French first, then the British, and then the French, and it became an American fort eventually. George Rogers Clark took a bunch of those forts during the Revolutionary War. My last name is Clark. I'm a descendant from not George Rogers Clark, and not the Clark that wandered the West. I'm his other brother's kid, so to speak, many, many generations later. So I've got heritage in the Midwest and heritage in the Revolutionary War, and we were here very early on, and it doesn't change anything. It doesn't make anything any better. It provides a connection to who we are, where we belong, and what we've done, and what we can continue to do. We need to continue to grow. We need to continue to adopt and allow people to come to this country who want to stay, who want to become citizens, and want to work and contribute. There are bunches of those. Don't lose sight of that if you get caught up in this whole war on immigration. Let's do it the right way. And let's allow people to be part of our community, because that's what we were based on. Very few of us. My wife's family came over on the Mayflower. Okay, so both of us can track our history back a long ways. Yet, we're immigrants. We contributed, our families contributed, we contribute. We will continue to contribute until we decide to run away to Ecuador or somewhere. I don't know where we're going. But that's neither here nor there. But it does have to talk about diversion. We use the internet, we use these channels, we use television and radio to distract us from our everyday life, as well as inform us about things, right? How many of you have been stuck on YouTube watching videos, or TikTok watching countless videos, right? So, the media is a gatekeeper. I talked about that earlier. We're going to dive in a little deeper on that, and I want to wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes, so we got to get moving. All right, here we go. The media is a gatekeeper. Its job is to relay, limit, expand, or reinterpret information. Relaying gets the message out to all. Think about a news story, right? Things like that. We get it out to all. Limiting. Sometimes media decides on what's important and what's not important, and therefore you don't find out about something that you would have really wanted to do. Expanding. The media can take a basic story and expand it and make sure that new witnesses, new information is uncovered, and we can learn more about it. Think Epstein file. Reinterpreting. Sometimes messages are too complex, too foreign, too strange for us to understand, and the media can help us break that down into bits and pieces that we can understand, or they can use analogies where we can draw inference from. Theories in communication. I do teach a whole course on mass communication at another school. So let's explore one of these strategies or theories that I believe is important, and the book does too. The cultivation theory. Cultivation theory is a media effects theory, and it was created by George Gerbner. It states that media exposure, specifically to television and internet, shapes our social realities by giving us a distorted view on the amount of violence and risk in the world. The theory also states that viewers can identify with certain values and identities that are presented as mainstream on television, even though they do not actually share those values or identities in their real lives. Basically, media can help cultivate and change who you are. Think about it. Okay. His analogy is just as farmer plants seeds, then he or she cultivates them over time to produce a crop, Media plants seeds in our minds and then cultivates them until they grow into a shared social reality. This is real, folks. I'm going to give you a fairly harmless version of this. In 1994, I was brought on to KPNT. I was still in college, and I was brought in as part of a team that would figure out what other college students would want to hear on the radio. We did questionnaires, we did, exploratory information seeking, and we got that information back to the radio station. They used that to tailor their radio programming even better. We started, myself and another individual who worked at the Riverfront Times with me at the time, started crossover working both at the newspaper and the radio station, and we brought in local bands. We basically by 1995-96 had created the whole format for that radio station. Now this is harmless cultivating, but it works. KPNT is still on the air today. Their formatting is largely similar to what it was back in the 90s because they play alternative music. And they still promote bands that are still on tour, like Local H and others. Good friends of mine. Wilco, Sunvolt. I'm trying to think of other bands that you would have heard of, probably. We helped create a culture that's still in existence today. So it's not necessarily a negative thing, but it could be a negative thing. And this is being used still on the internet today to social program. There's more on the cultivation theory. Read through it. I'm not going to ask a lot of information about this. I'm really not. I'm just going to probably the definition. But check it out. Check it out. These slides. Check it out. It's a viable. It works. I can prove it. I got more case studies than just that, but when you read through this, you'll start to think about it, And I want you to answer something to me, if you would, please. It's not exactly part of the homework, but I would like to hear your thoughts on this idea. Do you think we can be socially programmed? Just tell me what you think. So we know that we have the potential to be programmed through mass media, which means we need to develop media literacy so that we can be objective and figure out what's true, what's not true, and analyze the media and try to figure out what the angle is. What is their gain? What are they trying to accomplish here? Remember, all media messages are constructed. Even objective news stories are filmed, edited, and introduced in a way that frames and influence their meaning. Media structures and policies affect message construction. Okay. Each medium has different characteristics and allows different messages to be broadcast differently. Think about the Colbert Report versus a CBS Evening News. Media messages are constructed for particular purposes. All media messages are embedded with values and beliefs. Media messages influence our beliefs, values, attitudes, behaviors. And media messages can prevent change. Here's the list that I want you to really think about when you're consuming media. Who created this message? What did they hope to accomplish? What are their primary belief systems? What is my interpretation of this message? How and why might different people understand this message differently than I do? What can I learn about myself based on my interpretation and how it may differ from others? What lifestyles, values, and points of view are being represented or omitted in this message? What does that tell me about how other people live and believe? Does this message leave anything or anyone out? Why is this message being sent? Who sent it? What is it trying to tell me? Is it trying to sell me something? Is it trying to get me to believe something? All right, chapter 16, we're jumping through, and we're not going to, I've already covered bits and pieces of this. New media technology, digital media. So with the advent of the internet, digital media comes on, which means there's 0 and 1s. And think about it like this. Analog media, a record or a cassette tape would be analog media, right? But digital, think MP3 or our even cell phone recording something. Okay? Think about it. In the idea of a record or cassette tape, music being on them, or an MP3 file, music's on it, right? It's music. But the formats are completely different. The advent of digital media allows us to have personal media where we have our favorite bands, we have our favorite songs, we have our playlists, we have videos we like to watch, we follow people on YouTube, we follow people on TikTok, and now we produce things for those specific sets. When we think about social media, here we have a few. Obviously, TikTok's left out. This was early in the day, and some of these are basically going by the wayside. Just that fast. In 20 years of media, real media, 25 years, basically, we're going to start to see things slide. For instance, Facebook is the old people's social media channel, right? Media studies pioneer Marshall McLuhan emphasized long before what we now call new media existed that studying media and technology can help us understand our society. In short, he didn't believe we could study media without studying society. The two are bound together. And it's true. I've done a lot of research in this field. So, media critics point out that participants are not always equally distributed. And as we have customizable media choices, we select narrowly what we want to consume, and that can be a problem because we're ignoring alternate opinions, alternate ideas, and sometimes we're ignoring the very news around us, the very things that make things important. And I say that sometimes because what we found in the most recent 2 presidential elections are that, for you, those of you that are in the 18 to 25-year-old segment, good job. You showed up at the highest voter turnout level of all time for your age group, the last 2 elections. Kudos. Awesome job. Okay? The presidential elections, not talking off-cycle. Off-cycle, no one shows up. I hate to say that. We really need to be good voters and proactive there, but we're not always the best at it. What your generation's figured out is they don't like the media gatekeeping, and they choose to listen to a wide range of sources many times to get their information from, and that's a good thing. But make sure you're listening to all segments, all groups. Don't decide, I only want to listen to what I identify with. Folks, I listen to CNN, I read The Guardian, but I also look at CBS and I listen to Fox News. That's the left and the right. Where do I sit? The middle. Straight away the middle. I've been the middle all my life. I believe in people's rights. I believe in taking care of people and doing the right thing. But I also believe that there are limits to doing the right thing and taking care of people, because if people aren't willing to help take care of themselves, it creates a different narrative or different scenario. And we just need to encourage people to be productive. Sometimes that's what it is. I also understand that sometimes people are afflicted and have problems and can't work. And I do get that. But I want you to think about this. Make sure you're getting your news from all different types of sources. That way you can figure out what people's agendas are. My stepdaughter has told me this past year she's not exactly happy at the person she voted for, who did become president, because some of those policies that he has enacted have not helped her as a college student. And I said, well, if you looked at his policies and procedures and understood what he was running on, then if that was important to you, then you probably should not have voted that way. I'm not telling you how to vote, but that's part of researching and not just, well, I voted this way because everyone around me told me to vote this way, or the media I listened to told me to vote this way. Written word in podcast and YouTubes are becoming popular outlets for citizen journalism. I think citizen journalism is a great thing. However, make sure you're being as truthful as you can be and not just showing what you saw. Because many times, if you come late to the party, what you saw at the party is not the way the party started. Right? New media ethics, property rights, and copyrights have been a big deal. I'm not going to dive deep into that. I've got a whole course in that. I don't teach it here, but I can tell you where to find it. These are huge. Think about this. Taylor Swift recorded all of her albums. I'm not a big Taylor Swift fan, by the way. I have seen her play, but neither here nor there. It's not my style of music. Do you like some country music? Just not hers. That said, I feel that she's a great artist, and I loved what she did. She took control. She re-recorded all of her own stuff. That way, she controlled those files. Yep, the originals might be recorded previously and owned by somebody else, but now I can encourage my fans to listen to my files, my recordings. And eventually, she made enough money to buy back all her work. So, which tells you this: if you're an artist, don't lose control of your product. Prince. He was the first one I ever met and talked to about collective creativity and owning all of his work, and it made sense. Censorship is a real thing. We're starting to see government try to get involved in this. This is not good. It's never a good thing when government gets involved in censorship. Okay? Know your rights, know the amendments, know the Constitution. Now, that said, you might be thinking, oh, I'm anti-certain party, No, I'm not. I'm actually not. But I am anti-censorship. Now, do I believe everyone needs to consume the same media? No. Do I believe a 16-year-old needs to read Marquis de Sade? No. No. Okay? All right? I believe in selective censorship for a moment. Until you're 18, until you can figure out for yourself, or 21, until you can figure out for yourself. But I don't believe in banning something because historically it said a word that people use, which we know is a derogative term. I think we need to learn from our past and make sure we don't treat others like people treated others in this, 1850s or 60s, right? Let's be kind, be decent. We're all human beings. And sometimes we need a wake-up call and see the way people treated people and go, you know what? While we've evolved, we've become better, we still got a ways to go. Content filtering and surveillance, that's a real thing. Remember this. Our government watches us, NSA. Hey, NSA, I love you. Just in case you're looking at my YouTube, which they do run through their stuff. This has sort of become a necessary evil, but thank goodness we have a country that so far isn't like China or Russia or Saudi Arabia, right? Where they're blocking stuff from us. So let's be real, let's keep it free, let's keep the information flowing, let's be courteous to others as well. Now think about it. We do have blocks on pornography, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I think people need to look at sexual addiction as another form of addiction. For those who haven't thought about it that way, maybe look into it because it's a deal. It's a real deal. That said, we don't want our government getting involved like China does or Saudi Arabia does. Because we want to get our information and have our own niche and have our own stuff and be able to enjoy it. Unfortunately, this has led to cyber slacking. Does anyone know what cyber slacking is? Cyber slacking is where you're watching your channels and not doing your work that you're supposed to be doing at work. I see this a bunch. So remember, our personal media has made us reachable. Are we ever phone on us at all the time? We can always look at all these things, and some people can't handle it and put it down. In London, they created a tech-safe street where they literally put padding on light signposts, street light posts, and even put up barriers to where it routed people through to the lights so they didn't walk out in front of the cars. Most people would panic if they lost their cell phone. I probably would start to panic after about 2 to 3 hours because not so much. I lose connection to businesses and even potentially my students who know that they can reach me on an emergency. It's in your syllabus, by the way. How media affects our interpersonal relationships is huge. We're just now getting around to studying this. Is Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat connecting you to your friends? Or is it watering down your face-to-face socialization? Because you don't hang out with people because you already know what they're up to. And you don't need to check up on them, talk to them, stuff like that. Social networking sites have been our downfall in some ways, right? It's created less personal communication. I talk about that here. In the end, I'm not telling you how to live or post anything. Just be aware there are multiple agendas with tons of propaganda out there. I teach a class in propaganda. So just be willing to ask. Who created the message? What did they hope to accomplish? What are their primary belief systems? What's my interpretation of the message? How and why might different people understand and view this message differently than me? Sound familiar? Because I've told you this once before and I'm hitting it one more time. What can I learn about myself based on my interpretation and how it will differ from others? What lifestyles, values, and points of view are being represented or omitted in this messaging? What does it tell us about how other people live and believe? Does it exclude people? Why was this message sent? Who sent it? Is it trying to tell me something, sell me something, trying to get me to believe something? In conclusion, I hope this class helps you with your human communication for the rest of your life. It was my goal to share knowledge with you that could provide useful if applied. I want to thank you for the time that you've taken studying this skill, and this skill can provide you with a better, more fulfilling life. Thanks so much. Email me with any questions. Don't forget your homework. It's listed there in the unit. Have a great day.